When you try to build your own world, it's important to figure out how to convey your backstory, especially if your story takes place on an alien world. See, if your story already includes humans on Earth, even if it is a science fiction or dystopian tale, there's already assumed clues as to how your world works. The audience assumes, unless told or shown differently, these characters have to breathe oxygen, that they have to eat food, that they have children that are born and then grow into adults. When you have a completely alien world, you have to start from scratch. Such is the problem that you have when introducing a new property like Bionicle. Because you have this entirely new world that functions on different rules, you have to both introduce this completely new world, and you have to introduce the backstory for the current story you will be telling. In other words, you have a job that's twice as difficult, and that means that you also have to doubly use the bane of good storytellers everywhere, exposition. Exposition is tough to do when you're telling a story, because it can very quickly become boring and have your audience become disinterested in what you're telling. But you do still need it, and finding that balance, alongside finding out how to keep your audience engaged, is one of the hardest parts of developing a new story. The Legend of Mata Nui is a scene that introduces almost all of the early Bionicle media, and the reason why is pretty simple. It's an ingenious way of setting up the backstory, while also giving you reason to seek out exposition, instead of just being passively told it. Let's take a look at the version from the Mata Nui online game. This one, I personally believe, is the most powerful out of all the other versions of this scene, specifically from the ones from the movies Mask of Light and Legends of Mata Nui. It noticeably has no dialogue, but wordlessly conveys the backstory in a way that is intriguing and unique. The first thing you notice is the music. It's this eerie combination of an electronic synth note and what sounds like a Latin choir chant. This immediately sets our tone, something that's both technological but also mystical. The synth holds its note, setting the pacing for us. We know that this scene is going to be dramatic, almost mythological. The stones are probably the most creative element ever proposed for Bionicle's backstory. For one, they look primitive, tribal, like you would expect a village elder to be reciting this story, which, by the way, is what this is supposed to be, but we don't know that just from this scene. Our characters also need no words to be introduced. The white stone has a friendly look to him. It's soft and it's round. What is noticeable is the face is not smiling, but rather quite solemn. In one image, you've conveyed that not only this is the face of quote-unquote good, but an authoritative good. One that doesn't necessarily smile, but is still trusted. The rocks piling up represent the Matoran, and they're a little harder to decipher. What we can get from this, though, is that the rocks are indeed supposed to represent actual characters. We know this because the earlier stone, the Mata Nui stone, had a face on it. These rocks don't, but they move, and we can gather that because they move, they are not just regular rocks. They symbolize something, in this case, actual characters. The rock piles in front of the great Mata Nui stone again reinforces that he is an authority figure. He towers over all of the piles. Now Makuta is introduced, and this is where it gets interesting. His size is what's the most important thing here. It's interesting because we don't see a pebble turning black and fighting against the Mata Nui stone. This is a new stone, and one that is the same size as Mata Nui. In fact, in the sister animation seen in the Mask of Light movie, the Makuta stone towers over Mata Nui. We know that this is an adversary because of the black and red color, the jagged edges, and the cruel face. But what we also get is that these two are on equal footing. They are both the same size. Now, the scene in Mask of Light ends here, with Mata Nui falling back, indicating that he is defeated. That movie seems fit to start from here because they plan to introduce the Toa over the course of the movie, but personally I think that was a misstep. See, in the Motonui online game, 6 other stones fall from the sky, calling Makuta's smaller stones to crack and then Makuta himself. It's crucial that this scene exists because the movie Mask of Light, as well as the Motonui online game, follow the Matoran, the smaller stones. But the main Bionicle story follows these Toa. The Toa stones aren't as big as Motonui, so they aren't on the same level of power, but they're noticeably different than the smaller pebbles. They are also the ones that eventually kill Makuta. This scene is very important because it establishes the hierarchy for the world at large. We know that there is one very powerful person, and a lot of smaller, less powerful people, and then there's 6 special people in the middle, not as powerful as the big one, but not as small as the pebbles. It's also interesting to note that the pebbles were already there, and Makuta grows his own stones from beneath the ground, but the Toa stones fall from the sky, the same place that we saw Makuta and Motonui come from. The last bit that's important is that Makuta cracks. This is contrast to Motonui, who fell over and is buried by sand. The implication is that without this scene is that Makuta has killed Motonui. But with the scene we realize that if he had, Motonui would have cracked too. Something completely different happened to Motonui. We will eventually find out that he was just put to sleep. But as of right now, we still get this message across without any words. In fact, this entire backstory being conveyed completely visually is what makes this scene so creative to me. Everything about the scene, from the music to the objects used to the symbolism, carries a ton of meaning behind it. One of the core rules behind good storytelling is, when you can, show, don't tell. This is the absolute epitome of that. It's extraordinarily simple, minimalistic, honestly, but it gets the point across in a way that Exposition doesn't. In fact, the magic of the scene is that it creates a question in our minds. We aren't dwelling on a cliffhanger, we've seen a complete story from start to finish. Motonui is defeated by Makuta, and then the Toa stones come down and they defeat Makuta. That's a complete story. What we don't know is what this represents and how exactly these things will happen. See, this question, this parable, sits in our minds as we continue on and learn about the story. And so the brilliance of that is that we actually pay attention to exposition when it comes. When we're told about Motonui, we realize that he is the big stone, and instead of seeing it as information that we are burdened with, this in fact relieves us of the burden of our question. Ask any teacher in a school, do students pay more attention when you just teach them information or when you're directly answering their questions? The answer is obviously the latter. It's natural human instinct. We are curious, and absolving this curiosity is something that we have to actively search towards. This completely helps solve our problem of having to deliver 2 types of exposition: our backstory and our world. Our backstory is taken care of because audiences aren't bored, but rather completely engaged. And that's why I feel like the Motonui online game does this the best.